This episode of Primitive Culture is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the non-profit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org.
This is Tim Russ, Lieutenant Commander Tuvok on Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Open your mind to the past. All this may mean something.
It's a primitive culture. I'm just trying to blend in.
Some people think the future means the end of history. Well, we haven't run out of history quite yet.
Hello and welcome to Primitive Culture, a Trek FM podcast all about our history, our culture and how Star Trek relates to it. I'm Duncan Barrett and joining me today is Reverend Peter Organ and we're at the Church of St Michael, East Wickham. Hi Peter.
Hi.
It's good to see you.
Good to have you here.
Thank you so much for coming on the podcast and for allowing us to record in your place of work and your place of worship in this lovely church.
No worries, apologies for the echo, but it kind of comes with the territory.
That's fair enough, I think, Well, you get people who like to go to bed at night with the sounds of the Enterprise D kind of on loop by their bed, so maybe it's got that similar kind of, special ambience, I suppose, that you don't get anywhere else, certainly. Well, I wanted to talk to you, basically, because this is a topic that we've been keen to cover on Primitive Culture for some time, looking at religion in Star Trek, and I thought, well, who can I get on to talk about that? And then I came across you on Twitter. You're both a vicar, a Church of England vicar, and also a Star Trek podcaster, so you were kind of it was a bit of a no-brainer to try and get you involved to come onto this one. But before we sort of delve into this topic a bit, maybe you could tell me a little bit about how you got into Star Trek and how you got into the church and what your kind of journey was between those two things, because I guess they're not two things that necessarily obviously go together in some ways.
Okay. The easiest one to do is Star Trek, so we'll start with that.
Mm-hmm.
I'd seen a little bit of the original series when it was shown on BBC Two, but I always preferred Doctor Who back in those days.
Right, yeah.
And it wasn't really until I saw it became a very cherished copy of Wrath of Khan. I watched it so many times on video, I pretty much wore it out.
Mm-hmm.
And that really what sort of opened my mind to Star Trek rather more. And certainly, obviously, by the time you get to the movies, the effects are that much better. And
sure, yeah.
You're not getting little dots on the screen anymore. Actually getting and more than the same model shot all the time as well. So, and yes, that's the movies were the point at which Star Trek overtook Doctor Who. And, in terms of my fascination. Then Next Generation came out, and again, we didn't have Sky, so I had to watch it on BBC when they showed it, which was very exciting times. And then that morphed into Deep Space Nine, which was even more exciting as far as I was concerned.
Yeah, definitely.
Since then, Voyager, I was so keen on, and Enterprise much less so, it has to be said.
Right.
Seemed to be retreading a lot of old grounds and old plots.
Not a huge amount to talk about today, probably about Enterprise. I think Enterprise definitely signalled a bit of a shift away from an interest in kind of spiritual topics and religious topics.
Yeah, I mean, Phlox mentions that he attended some religious ceremonies on Earth, including at the Vulcan consulate, interestingly. We don't tend to think of the Vulcans and religion, but then again, Star Trek 3 is full of Vulcan religion, one way or another.
Yeah.
But yes, it's pretty much it when it comes to Enterprise. And Voyager, likewise, was more about sort of science, and it was could be arguably said to be the most sciencey of all the treks, to the point that those of us without a grasp of astrophysics were sort of sitting there going, what are they talking about now?
Although there was that quite nice episode early on where Janeway had to go on a kind of spiritual quest, which I have to say, when I watched it in the 90s, I hated that episode. It really didn't work for me at all. And then I came back to watch it a couple of years ago, and I loved it. I found it really gripping and really interesting.
And Chakotay's that's about the one interesting bit about him, not that they made much of it, but that whole thing about the Dream Quest and
see, for me, weirdly in the 90s, that kind of worked for me as a teenager or whatever. I kind of accepted that, but now I've heard all these stories about how they got all the details wrong. The advisor they had advising them on Chakotay was just feeding them nonsense, basically. They made up.
It's not particularly authentic. It has to be said from what little I know. Yeah,
but I guess maybe as an audience member back then, if you didn't know much about Native American religions, it kind of it played into your expectations in some way, and it seemed quite interesting. But I guess there was that element they were using it as a slightly kind of exotic, kind of unusual take on religion. And of course, what we don't see very much in Star Trek is the kind of, when we see religion, it tends to be alien religions, or it tends to be, you know, in that case, Native American religion, which, you know, obviously is based on Earth and based in reality and so on, but at the same time, it's very unfamiliar. We don't tend to see much, other than that brief mention from Phlox, as you said, where he talks about, you know, studying Hinduism and so on, talking a little bit about real Earth religions. But generally speaking, Earth religion, in terms of kind of religious practice as it exists in the real world, is something that is left out of Star Trek on the whole.
For the most part, yeah. The only sort of bits and pieces, like Data's Day, they mentioned that there was a Hindu festival of light on the Enterprise that day, which bit of a surprise, really. Certainly not something that ever features on screen. But yes, again, Next Generation wasn't particularly sort of... If you found a religion, it was somebody else's planet, basically, and usually, generally, rather like the original series, they were to be brought into the light of
It was a bad
science.
thing, yeah.
Yes. And the original series has a really interesting take on religion, of course, because there you've got... It's very much... usually it's a mad computer that's behind it all, or it's a super powerful alien being that is masquerading as a god, but is brought down a peg or two by Kirk, one way or another. So, yeah.
And partly, of course, that's, I suppose, Gene Roddenberry's influence. You know, personally, he was a very committed atheist. I mean, quite a sort of strident atheist, I think. I'm going to read you a couple of quotes I dug up from Gene Roddenberry, just to put into context, because I think we talk about how Roddenberry was kind of anti-religion and so on, but maybe we don't necessarily think about how vehemently he felt that. He said, in one interview, he said, religion was a substitute brain. And in another, he said, I condemn the effort to take away the power of rational decision, to drain people of their free will, all religions which use the notion of God as a weapon against humanity. So very much, and you can sort of see that attitude towards religion in a lot of those original series episodes, where, as you say, Kirk will come in and sort of dismantle some whole belief system. You know, famously in the Apple, I suppose, where they
that's
you know, sort of break the computer.
You even got a giant snake head in the Garden of Eden there, don't you? So it goes the full hog with the Apple.
Yeah. But I'm interested. I mean, for me, you know, I grew up as an atheist, so for me, I suppose part of the appeal of Star Trek was this kind of humanism, it was this kind of scientific outlook and so on. But I'm interested for you, as someone of, you know, obviously a very deep religious faith and so on, presumably. Did that...
One would hope.
One would imagine, yeah. Did that trouble you at all watching Star Trek, or was it something you were aware of? Or?
No, because certainly with the original series, it didn't seem particularly connected to the sort of religion I was experiencing. I mean, there wasn't generally a computer behind the scenes running everything in church.
As far as you know.
As far as I know, yeah. That would have made church possibly more exciting, I don't know. But yeah, no, it wasn't. I was watching Star Trek for the aliens and for the spaceships, which, as I say, is one of the reasons why the original series didn't quite grab me as much as the movies onwards, because there were, you know, it's only once you get to the movies and they've suddenly got a lot more budget and ability to create interesting looking aliens and lots of very exciting spaceship shots that really got me hooked. And the sort of the absence of religion didn't really hit me so much until Next Generation. And I think the one that really sort of sticks in the mind is Who Watches the Watchers, which has not the gentlest approach to religion ever. Also hand in hand with the suggestion that Picard ought to act as God at one point as well, because he's already influenced this society who sort of, you know, they turned away from religion. Now seeing Enterprise crew members and the duck blind and all that has meant that they're now going back to it again. So Picard's got to play God to try and rectify. It's like, what, really?
And he's absolutely, I mean, the word he uses is horrifying. I think he's so appalled at this idea that, as you say, this kind of almost slightly clumsy archaeologist or anthropologist or whatever it is saying, you know, well, you know, yes, we've messed up here, but maybe this is the least worst outcome, basically, is you just pretend to be God for a bit and tell them what to do, and we'll kind of, you know, brush it all under the carpet somehow. The weird thing is, I mean, Picard in that episode is completely, you know, like I say, appalled at that idea. There's no way he'll engage with that. He talks about sending them back to the Dark Ages, these, you know, enlightened proto-Vulcans. By the time we get to, say, Voyager, you see, like in the episode Prophecy, there's the Klingon sort of cleric who's basically saying to B'Elanna, well, you know, you can interpret the texts how you like. You know, maybe you could kind of guide these people towards a certain interpretation. And, you know, because there's this discussion about whether her unborn daughter is going to be the Klingon savior or not. She is deeply skeptical of this idea. as are a lot of the Klingons. And the Klingon priest is almost taking quite a kind of pragmatic approach, sort of saying, well, I don't know whether it's true or not. I don't know whether this prophecy is a load of nonsense, but, from the point of view of my crew, from the point of view of these 200 people or whatever, it would be really helpful if we could kind of encourage them to believe this. And in the end, she does sort of go along with it. So there's that weird shift to almost doing what Picard was refusing to do and sort of not playing God exactly, but kind of going along with this religious belief for the sake of the people who it's helping in some way.
And certainly as next generation goes on, it becomes somewhat more nuanced in its approach to religion, particularly to developing the Klingon religion, when they effectively clone Klingon Jesus for an episode in Rightful Heir, which I actually did a talk on at Theological College.
Oh, wow.
Showed a bit of that, and I was doing a subject called bioethics, where you're looking at the ethics behind medicine and developments in science. And that was obviously a really interesting one to look at, and that whole question about, you've cloned this person, but he isn't necessarily going to be a complete copy of the original. Obviously, there's a nature nurture business going on there. So that for me was a lot more an interesting approach to religion.
There's also that thing that I suppose science fiction can do. I mean, first of all, you've got the fact that they can create a clone of their kind of messiah character, and therefore they can bring them back without having to wait for this kind of divine event in the future. But there's also the fact that I suppose because it's science fiction, because it's a kind of fantastical world, you can have these stories, and they do crop up now and then where, one of these kind of prophesied beings, messiah or whatever, does turn up, and it raises these questions. How do people cope? I mean, I'm thinking of the episode Ascension in Deep Space Nine, where Sisko gives up his kind of status as the emissary to this poet who seems to have a better claim because he went into the wormhole first. And there's this kind of ambiguity about, well, since the prophets don't really understand linear time, did they intend him to be the emissary? Did they intend Sisko to be the emissary or whatever? And Sisko is quite relieved to give up the mantle of being this kind of religious icon. But then this new emissary starts saying all these appalling things and bringing back the caste system and so on. And I was talking actually on Twitter this week with one of our other hosts on the Trek FM network, Brandon, about, he'd also been watching this episode recently, and he was talking about it in terms of his Christian faith and so on. And I said, one of the things that I had trouble with in that episode was I could understand that this guy had this kind of effect on society and so on, but it was a step too far for me when Kira literally said, right, I'm going to quit my job. This religious figure has told me I have to go and be an artist. I'm clearly hopeless at art. We've seen that in the episode, but I'm going to go and do it anyway. And we even have one of the priests who murders someone for refusing to go along with the caste system, again on the grounds, well, the emissary told me so. But it did sort of raise this question to me. I was saying to Brandon, well, if your messiah came back and said everyone should do X, Y, Z, and that involved quitting your job, or that involved, murder or whatever it is, how far would you go in that situation? Because I guess in reality, that's not something that people have had to deal with, but hypothetically it could be. Do you know what I mean? What would
I suppose your closest parallel for certainly Christianity anyway. In our time, if the Pope decides tomorrow, the birth control is an example where a decision was handed down from on high, and everybody was, for Roman Catholic anyway, was expected to toe the party line. Interesting to see just how many don't, and there's sort of widespread disregard of it because it's seen as not a very logical thing to ask people to do. So I think Kira is interesting in that one, and there's also the one that's at the end of season 1 of Deep Space Nine,
In the Hands of the Prophets, about the teaching of not evolution, but teaching
yes, exactly that whole discussion. And again, she seems to be going along sort of resisting Sisko, butting up against him, pointing out that actually Keiko isn't necessarily being as balanced as she could be, and all that sort of business. And it looks like it's heading in one direction, only to be for Kira to be pulled back again, realising that actually that's not the way forward. I mean, when I was doing my theology degree, before I even went forward for ordination, there was a poster on the dean's wall that said that Jesus died to take away your sins, not your brain. And I think that's very important. And that kind of ties into what Roddenberry's big beef with religion is that if it's being used as a substitute for thinking for yourself, then clearly it's not a good thing. But if it's part of your system of making sense of the world around you, and it currently fits, rather like the Bajoran system. I mean, I mean, Deep Space Nine has a lovely have your cake and eat it approach to religion, particularly in the religion of the Bajorans, because yes, they worship their gods, but it turns out the gods are real. They might be very advanced aliens, original series, but ultimately, because they exist outside of time, they do know what's going to happen. And you can have prophets who get a vision for what's going to happen because they know. So it's a lovely way of having it both ways, and it enables Deep Space Nine to explore religious practice in a way that isn't quite so antagonistic as previous Trek approaches to it have been. And Kira generally is a fairly sympathetic character. Faith is always very important to her. Sometimes, yes, she sort of dallies with fundamentalism, but she always seems to get drawn back again. That's
an interesting point. Yeah, I was wondering whether it's partly me watching it from an atheist perspective, and I'm always a bit surprised when Kira. I know she has this faith, but at the same time, there's lots of people that I know in my life who have faith, but it's not something that's at the forefront necessarily most of the time in your dealings with them. And it's when it suddenly impacts on her job, or it impacts in some kind of major way, or she's going to make some huge life decision because of it. It always takes me slightly by surprise. But, at the same time, this guy Brandon, who I was talking to about it, he said, well, no, he bought into that. He understood that was a fundamental part of her character. It made perfect sense to him that she would behave in that way, in that situation, because that was so important to her.
And it's quite often, if a society's been under the thumb of another society for a while, and particularly if religion has been trodden on, I mean, just looked at the countries in Eastern Europe, Poland, for an obvious example, where it's, as soon as things are, that their faith becomes far more key identifying part of who they are. It's part of their resistance, effectively.
Yeah, I think absolutely that's true. And one of the things that I think is quite nice about the way that these religious themes are handled in Deep Space Nine is that there's the episode, I think it's in The Rapture, when Kai Wynn has that moment with Kira where she says, oh, you think I lack courage? And she talks about being imprisoned in the camps during the occupation and how the Vedics were treated. And, the thing I love about Deep Space Nine is the way the writers are always able to kind of subvert your expectations, and kind of, you think you understand everything about a given situation, and then they give you some kind of nugget that forces you to look at it slightly differently. And Wynn is a brilliant example because, she's probably the character we most love to hate. She's such a despicable person, and she sort of embodies almost everything that is wrong about religion potentially, or that can be perverted about religion in a way. She's like the sort of ultimate bad priest in some ways. And at the same time, then she says something like that, and you suddenly get a kind of flash of insight into her, and you think, oh, have I judged her too harshly? She did stand up for this thing, and she did suffer for it.
That's the joy of Deep Space Nine, is it's no character is two-dimensional baddie or goodie. They all have different facets to their character. I mean, even Gold the Cat can do something, altruistic and loving occasionally. Whereas next week he'll probably end up being equally loathable. But and Wynn is a very good example. I love the way in the Bajoran religion isn't just presented as a monochrome. All the Vedics are like this. There are clearly different denominations, to use an Earth term, and some are more fundamental than others. Some are very strange. The episode The Storyteller, it would have been interesting if Kira had gone down on that rather than O'Brien and Bashir, because that seemed very different to the Bajoran religion as it had been presented up till then, and afterwards, to be honest, a lot more sort of this idea of sort of monsters and preying on people as well, to an extent as well. So it was a very different sort of approach to the same religion, but clearly a different branch to it, in the same way as Christianity has a sort of spectrum from Roman Catholicism. You've got Mormonism, you've got Protestant churches, so that and there are some that, like myself, who don't have a particular problem with most of science. There are others that if it's not in the Bible, it ain't true.
Yeah, and definitely we get that sense that Wynn is representing quite an orthodox, sort of quite a conservative, strict sort of side of the church. I guess Vedic Bareil is the obvious sort of liberal,
much
more laid back. He doesn't go around grabbing people's ears. He doesn't
even like it happening to him.
Exactly. And he's got a girlfriend, Kira, and he's quite sort of laid back about all this sort of stuff, and very much seems to be representing I guess what we might think of as a more sort of modern or a more kind of open version of the church in a way. And you're right. It's interesting that Deep Space Nine, I think, is quite good at avoiding falling into the trap of presenting all the Vedics as being the same somehow, and that we do get that variety. And that's again, a great element of it. I was just thinking about this thing you were saying about science and religion as well, because, you're right, in that early episode in Deep Space Nine, when Wynne comes on the scene the first time, it's very much in this kind of science versus religion battle, and it's Keiko on one side and Wynne on the other. And it's interesting, as you said, that repeatedly in Deep Space Nine, we get this kind of workaround of saying, well, prophets, wormhole aliens, it doesn't really matter. It's all the same thing. It's just words. It's just kind of a matter of perspective. And I think that's sort of one of those ways that Star Trek in the 90s in Deep Space Nine and also Voyager kind of manages to incorporate religion in some ways without threatening the kind of scientific whole. But it's quite interesting, just thinking about that Voyager episode again, Sacred Ground, that Janeway goes through this whole quest as a very committed, rational, scientific atheist, wanting to find a scientific explanation. And the whole episode is geared towards, put down the tricorder, stop doing your scanning, stop kind of trying to understand it rationally, just go with it, see what happens and kind of experience this thing. And ultimately she has to kind of make a leap of faith that although she can't really account for what's changed or what's happened, she's going to risk her life to save Kes, because she's sort of been told that it will work and she won't die as a result. And then there's that wonderful scene at the end of the episode where the Doctor gives the scientific explanation and says, well, these particles are built up in your body, and then when you did this other thing and this combined with this, it enabled you to survive the thing. And the weird thing is that the scientific explanation comes to sound as kind of hollow and meaningless to Janeway. Yeah. And there's just that scene where she just sort of sits there not really concentrating, then leaves the room. And I think it's a brilliant, I guess this is the thing that me as a teenager hated about this episode in a way, was I was kind of very much against the lesson of it, but I've obviously mellowed because I was more willing to hear that in the last few years, and more willing to just take it as Janeway's journey and as that kind of experience of realizing that the things that you felt certain about, maybe aren't as concrete as you thought, or that there are things that you don't understand or that you're not going to be able to understand.
And that idea that there can be more than one way of explaining something, and they're not necessarily in conflict. So yes, they're wormhole aliens, yes, they're prophets. They can actually exist as both things without it being problematical. Yeah.
Well, obviously this is a huge topic, talking about religion in Star Trek. We're not going to probably hit on every possible example, but I thought one way that we could kind of approach it and one way we could kind of look into it is looking in terms of the kind of not so much just religions in Star Trek, the Klingon religion, the Bajoran religion or whatever, but looking at kind of real world religious stories, religious ideas, particularly Christian ideas, because I suppose those are the ones that we're probably the most familiar with and the writers of Star Trek are most familiar with, and the ways that those have been used in Star Trek. So the first one that came to mind for me was Eden. And obviously we talked a little bit about the apple and this idea of this kind of Eden planet, and Kirk comes in, as Satan or the serpent or whatever, and basically corrupts them with knowledge and brings them into the swinging 60s and tells them they should all be off having sex and making babies and all this kind of thing. But actually Eden is something that comes up quite a few times. We get it obviously in The Way to Eden. There's this idea of this planet Eden that they're going to. We even get it in Star Trek 6, with the painting of the expulsion from paradise. Yeah. And that sort of idea that paradise is always going to be lost, that it's temporary. It's something you can't hold on to.
And an interesting thing for Spock to have in his quarters, isn't it?
It's very strange. Yeah, I agree. I mean, every time I watch that film, it sort of strikes me as more odd that he has that there. But again, it kind of adds to, in the context of the film, we know that it's the last original series film. He contextualizes it in terms of, this perfect thing ending, this kind of, the kind of sadness of that. It sort of makes me think a bit of like the final lines of Paradise Lost, with these, beautiful lines about Adam and Eve holding hands and basically walking away, almost into the distance away from the camera together, as this kind of like, that thing is over. And I suppose there's that element to it. But it also just plays into this kind of interesting idea, I think, in the original series in particular, with paradise and the kind of impossibility of paradise, and whether human beings are equipped for paradise almost. Kirk has, in the Paradise Syndrome, he has this speech about, we have to pull ourselves up by our, we're kind of grittier than that. We shouldn't be kind of succumbing to this kind of heavenly, Edenic sort of world. The same thing in the Nexus, I suppose, the kind of the pleasures of this, garden of wonders almost. And always there's this idea there's something seductive and dangerous about it. And I was thinking, even in The Wrath of Khan, in a way, you get the same thing with Genesis. And obviously, it's called the Genesis device. It basically makes a Garden of Eden. It makes a planet of Eden. And McCoy has that line, where he says very much in the kind of Roddenberry mold, he says, according to myth, the earth was created in 6 days. He doesn't use the word God. He doesn't he calls it a myth. But there's something about the way he says it, it almost makes me feel, obviously he's saying the Genesis device is a kind of unnatural phenomenon. It's kind of man overreaching. But there's something about it almost feels like he's saying it's blasphemous. Do you know what I mean? There's something kind of fundamentally wrong about it. And of course, the planet basically falls apart. It's all a disaster.
Yeah,
he turns out to be right.
Yes, indeed. And there's the sort of the haste. I think partly it's that idea of, sort of, just because you can do a thing isn't necessarily a good idea that you do it, and not thinking it through first. So, and that ultimately proves to be real, because it creates so many problems in the future. So much so that at least a couple of the later movies keep referring to it all the time. But that sense in which humanity needs to stop and think. Sometimes it's got all this technological capability, and let's face it, Genesis is pretty mind blowing in terms of its technological ability. But perhaps we ought to stop and question why before we start rushing to do this sort of thing.
But I suppose it's that interesting element of the kind of Kirk, Spock, McCoy sort of trifecta that, McCoy, I guess, obviously typically represents the kind of human side, the emotional side, the kind of passionate side, as opposed to the kind of cool scientific side. But in that instance where it's science sort of gone awry, you do almost get that sense that, Spock is sort of, because Spock says to him, you've got to govern your passions, don't get worked up about this.
Genesis makes sense.
This is science.
From a science, if you can do it, scientifically speaking, do it, because, then you're pushing forward the boundaries of science. And I think McCoy is rather saying, well, perhaps we should look at this more ethically, and what are the consequences of doing this, not necessarily in terms of what we'll achieve, but in terms of how that will change us as not just a human race, obviously, but as the Federation, and also those around us as well.
I guess it's one of those things, it's almost like, the ethics of cloning, or of kind of, any of these kind of reproductive technologies or things like that are where scientific or medical technology is in some way in conflict with kind of religious traditions, and do you know what I mean? These kind of things.
And of course, genetic modification is a very interesting one for Star Trek. For,
exactly.
The whole history of it, because scientifically, again, they've got the ability to do it, but there's all this sort of stuff that happened in the past with Khan, and there's the reason why we don't do it anymore. And even when there seems to be quite sound reasons for doing it, and with Bashir and what do they call them, the pack. Jack Pack. There's there are huge questions about whether it's ethical to use their abilities or whether it's actually unethical to just let them do nothing and be shot away in a cargo bay, which they are for most of the episodes. I mean, that brings out interesting questions as well.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, I guess from Eden, the next kind of step up in a way for Star Trek is dealing with God. And obviously we see in the original series, I guess we see Apollo, god, but kind of a god that's, even by modern standards or in the 1960s or whatever, has indisputably fallen out of favour. And I guess a lot of people with that episode, Who Mourns for Adonais, there's this sort of question over it. And I've heard a lot of discussion about the dialogue in that episode and how it seems to pull in two different directions, because Kirk has these lines. He keeps saying, we've outgrown you. We have no need for gods anymore.
Yeah,
but then he has this line,
we only need one god.
I know, and it's kind of, I think people have wrestled with that. And, one interpretation is to say, well, clearly Gene Roddenberry didn't write that line. Someone stuck that in. Yeah, exactly. Somehow that line got in there. But there is that kind of, I suppose, in terms of 1960s TV and so on, it was maybe that the level of that, of like Roddenberry's atheism, was problematic to some extent. So there would be kind of attempts to moderate it a little bit. But obviously by the time you get to Star Trek V, we have seemingly a film about God. And we at least temporarily, it seems like we have actually found God and we've met God. And McCoy, again, is the one who says you don't ask the Almighty to show his ID or whatever it is. So McCoy seems to have pretty much kind of accepted that it might well be God, and that maybe we should at least, be cautious about how we deal with that situation in case it is God. Yeah. And Roddenberry famously didn't like Star Trek V. And I have to say, I never liked Star Trek V. It's kind of grown on me a little bit. But the weird thing about Star Trek V is actually, it's not God. It's a fake. It's the Wizard of Oz. It's a complete con. And actually, they go in search of God and they find this really nasty, malevolent kind of monster that starts zapping people and so on. And Kirk is the one who sees through it. As throughout the original series, he's the one who says, no, that's not a God. It's just, whatever. It's a fake. It's a machine. It's, let's destroy it, basically. But at the same time, I suppose the kind of what was a departure for Star Trek in some ways with that film was that there was this kind of there was some degree of a serious quality given to the idea of the search for meeting God, and that was a possibility, and that was something that they could engage with. So Kirk might think Sybok's mad, but at the same time, the film doesn't completely discount him until you get to that point.
And Sybok himself has, he finds out that he's been chasing something that doesn't turn out to be God, but he has a palpable effect on his followers. There's interesting questions about, sort of cult, and certainly I think when Shatner was writing it, that he'd been watching televangelists, and that was kind of his inspiration. But you look at Sybok himself, and he doesn't seem to be as badly manipulative. In fact, he seems to be giving people a sense of healing, and even including McCoy over his relationship with his father and the decision he had to make about his father. And it's interesting that, of course, Kurt decides he's not going to go through the process. So he
doesn't want to be saved, basically.
Exactly, yes. And Spock goes halfway because he goes through the process, but it doesn't make any difference to him because actually he's already at peace with himself. So that for me is really fascinating. The bit about discovering God is kind of because it's not going to be God even when you first watch it.
That would have been a bold move.
It would have been an incredible move, yes, and problematical move. Let's face it. But it's
they
what
get pretty close.
They
get closer than you might expect them to, I suppose, possibly, in that film.
And there is, and as I say, there is healing in that film. Interestingly,
And
a better film. I do like Star Trek V, but very camp reasons. But a better film would have explored more what Sybok was doing and how he had affected the other crew members as well. But as per usual, the focus was very much on Kirk throughout. So.
And indisputably, I suppose that scene. Some people love the campfire scene, other people love, but that scene with with McCoy's pain in particular, and Spock as well, is the kind of dramatic high point of the film. Yes. And that is the scene that really lands, partly because of the performances, it's real kind of drama. There's a kind of raw drama there that's very effective. The funny thing is, you said Shatner was thinking of the televangelists and so on. What it made me think of watching it recently is the Scientologists, and the idea that, that Scientology can kind of equip you to lose your anxieties, to lose your kind of negative feelings, that basically all these kind of negative things that you've built up around yourself psychologically can kind of be cured. It's almost like the ultimate antidepressant. Somehow it will come in and have this effect on you. And obviously, if you've seen documentaries about Scientology and so on, there are all these weird processes that people go through to kind of, first almost, I don't know, sort of debasing themselves somehow and releasing all this stuff and then being kind of rebuilt, maybe at peace or rebuilt or whatever it is. And it is I don't think I'm going to offend any of our listeners by saying it seems cultish, but who knows? I think certainly to an outsider that seems like a reasonable label to
most people's
put on the
definition of cult. But, it fits. Yeah, the key thing, of course, and what Sybok doesn't do is he doesn't charge anybody for this process.
He doesn't know, but he does demand that they come along with him on a mission, to the end of the universe that could easily end in their death. So
he doesn't demand, interestingly.
Well, that's
he gives them the choice.
That's
all the
true.
time.
He gives them the choice. But I suppose the thing is, I guess there is this question with Sybok. To what extent has he just brainwashed people? Because that's certainly how it comes across. That's why it seems quite kind of culty. Because it feels like they've almost taken the pill and they're like,
it involves some sort of a mind meld, and that starts making you think, well, what's he doing with their heads? How is he rewiring them?
Yeah, exactly.
Is he actually healing them, or is he actually just brainwashing them to follow him? But I don't think the film actually comes down one side or the other particularly interestingly. It seems rather more open-minded. It kind of wants him to be not a hero by the end, but certainly a sympathetic character by the end. And obviously then he realises that he was wrong, and in a way that cult figures probably never do. So
it is, in some senses, it's a film that sort of lacks a villain in a way, because
it ends up being God.
Isn't exactly a villain. It's that weird monster, and we don't really, other than the fact that it was imprisoned, so we kind of assume that it did something bad at some point in the past. We don't really learn anything about it. Do you know what I mean? It's kind of
the budget ran out at that point. Sadly.
Yeah, there you go. So we didn't get the rock monsters, and we didn't get to find out, really what on earth was going on there.
Yeah,
which I think may be another reason that the kind of message of the film in some ways is a bit murky, because that ends, and it ends, and it's got the nice scene between Kirk and Spock, and they go back to their campfire and so on. So it's all the stuff around the end is more about those relationships.
And the final scenes on the Enterprise end in a very, very Star Trek theme moment where, the question of where is God and very clumsily. Kirk says, well, perhaps he's here, pointing to the human heart. And it's like, yeah, that's pretty much the Star Trek level, isn't it, really? That's what we'd expect you to find by the
See,
end.
that works for me, though. You know, I don't know. I thought that was the kind of interesting... I mean, I'm curious whether that... I don't know. I sort of bought that. I bought that as Kirk's position. I bought that as a kind of... I mean, it's a bit weird because he's sort of asserting that as if right, I'm the captain, so listen to me, you know, almost. But at the same time, I kind of felt like that was it's a sort of good compromise everyone can kind of go home with, and, you know, now we can get back to, you know, melting marshmallows and singing songs and, you know, kind of get on with our lives in a way. But obviously, I suppose the God figure or the monster or whatever we want to call him, the fake God in Star Trek V isn't the only kind of God that we see even in later Star Trek. I mean, I'm thinking of, for example, the Edo God in Justice, which is quite a kind of, you know, it is a machine, or I think they talk about it as being more like a ship. There are people in it.
It looks like a space station, and they actually use the model later on as a space station, so that's presumably kind of what they were going for.
So it's sort of slightly unclear whether it's an entity or a sort of group.
I think it's Next Generation's version of the computer for various computers from the original series, basically.
But it's interesting, what struck me about that episode is it feels very much like a sort of Old Testament God. You know, it's very much because the episode is all about justice, it's all about punishment, executions, all this sort of thing. And it speaks with a booming voice and it says, leave my children alone, and, you know, all this sort of thing. Exactly. And then Picard has to make this sort of more sort of New Testament-y kind of, you know, a bit like, you know, the sort of almost the Vedic Burial end of kind of religion, of being a bit more open and, you know, considering alternatives and kind of not being closed-minded and so on. And so it almost feels like there's that kind of, although Picard is this complete sort of rational atheist, there's that kind of tension there between this kind of, you know, older version of a God who's kind of wrathful and very strict and punishing people, and this kind of idea of, I suppose, mercy in a way, and kind of recognising, well, someone might have done something wrong, but we can, you know, let that slide on this occasion.
Yes, it's a very very clumsily done. It has to be said, but yes, it's there. and the way it all wraps up in a few seconds at the end is fairly unconvincing. It has to be said, but
it's probably not one of Next Generation's strongest episodes.
No, it was in the first season, to be fair.
I mean, Picard does a nice speech, and, you know, like you said, the model is, you know, it looks pretty good, the Edo God model thing. The other one that came to mind for me was the caretaker in Voyager, who's very much, you know, in that sort of traditional mould of an old man with a beard, and this kind of, you know, slightly curmudgeonly but basically kind old man. But then, of course, the interesting thing about the caretaker is he is a god insofar as he's perceived as a god by the Okampa, but the whole story is about him dying. And, you know, so it brings this idea, you know, God is dying. You know, Nietzsche said God is dead. How are they going to cope without their God? And I suppose there's that kind of... But then for the Voyager crew, they go off on a mission, you know, at the end of Caretaker, they're hoping to find the other caretaker. They're hoping to find another one of these sort of super powerful beings to send them home. And it always sort of strikes me as strange how often, given that Star Trek is, for the most part, quite kind of rational and scientific and so on, how the pilots of all these, you know, different series, how often they involve some kind of super powerful godlike entity. Do you know what I mean? So you've got the prophets in Deep Space Nine, you know, you've got Q, and also those kind of weird jellyfish things, and there's stuff going on in Encounter at Farpoint. You've got the caretaker in Voyager. It's sort of, I don't know, it's surprising. I think when you watch Voyager and you sort of get into that story, you kind of almost forget how it was that they got stranded there in the first place, because the emphasis is all about Janeway destroying the array, and that seems very scientific and rational and so on. But then this kind of weird, mysterious, godlike figure who dragged them there, we almost forget about somehow.
And his relationship with the planet below and Kez. It does get... They sort of move on quite quickly from there, don't they, basically?
They do, definitely, they do. I guess the other thing we could talk about, the kind of other side of that, and something that comes into... when we were talking about the Garden of Eden and these kind of, you know, Edenic stories, is the role of, you know, in The Apple, Kirk describes himself. Does he describe himself, or does either or Spock or McCoy? Well, anyway, there's some discussion of Kirk basically playing the kind of role of the serpent, or playing the role of the tempter, and so on. And actually, these kind of satanic figures do crop up now and then in Star Trek. I guess. I'm thinking the most obvious one is in the animated series, in the Magics of Megas 2, where we get Lucian, who basically is as kind of unambiguously Lucifer as you can get.
Pitchfork and,
with pitchfork and horns and, you know, and hooves and everything. But at the same time, he's kind of... he's a nice guy. He's quite gregarious. He's quite chatty. You know, he keeps saying, "Oh, friend Kirk, come with me," and you know, and they like him. He's a very likable guy. And there's this sort of question, I suppose, in that episode. It seems like they're not. I mean, first of all, they are saying that the devils were aliens or whatever, so that is the kind of traditional Star Trek message. But they're also sort of saying that they were misunderstood, and it sort of reminds me of that. You know, William Blake said of Milton that he was of the devil's party without knowing it. That kind of sympathy for the outcast, sympathy for the kind of fallen angels and so on. And that's definitely there in that story, which, you know, is quite, I mean, it's a pretty crazy story as it is.
Most of the animated series, but yes.
It's again quite a bold thing to put on TV, you know, even in a cartoon for kids or whatever on a Saturday morning. It's an interesting take that Star Trek puts in there, I think. Yes,
it does stick out as well, particularly compared to the original series. Generally it's not quite so obvious as that, as, you know, who the bad guys are. And he is kind of one of those sort of, there's a lot of chaotic figures, aren't there, in the original series. Squire of Gothos. There are several sort of very, very powerful beings they come up with. Alan Q, I suppose, is like the next generation version.
Sort of trickster
type.
gods, I suppose.
With enough power that actually the crew are in trouble around them, but they're nevertheless, they're not completely evil necessarily, and they can be sort of be won over by a good argument from Picard, or they can be won over by, you know, Kirk's ability to turn any situation round, basically.
We get again, I guess, a kind of the other closest I can think of to a kind of Satan character, which is an interesting one, is again in Voyager, where we have that episode Coda, where this alien is trying to lure Janeway into his matrix. He talks about, and there's all this discussion about, is this the afterlife? Basically, you know, he's saying, "You're dead, you know, come with me," and she actually says at the end, "Go back to hell, coward." So although she's supposedly this rational atheist, she's kind of identified him with the devil almost, and with this idea that he's trying to drag her to hell. And then she has this discussion with Chakotay about, you know, is it possible that his species, again, I suppose it's that idea, you know, well, maybe we can understand that hell is a real thing, and it's a scientifically understandable thing, and there's a species of weird aliens that drag us there after death and so on, and, you know, that's not something that we want to do. But again, it's kind of, it always struck me as surprising that she has that line where she kind of explicitly makes that connection, whether she...
She's using it as a metaphor, I think, would be my guess.
Because he's this kind of evil figure who lurks at the point of death. He backs off into this kind of fiery, whatever it looks like, sort of Eye of Sauron, into this kind of fiery portal almost. I don't know, I sort of feel like it's sort of skirting a bit of a line, that episode, where you're kind of wondering, well, you know, what are we being shown here? Is that Doctor Who episode, you know, the David Tennant Doctor Who, where they go and find a kind of giant Satan monster?
Yes.
Isn't there, you know, The
Satan Pit. Yes, there's a
two
two-parter, wasn't it? Yeah. Which, I mean, again, Doctor Who's done that before with the original run of Doctor Who and the Demons. The main character from which, Zale, looks just like that one in the animated series.
Right, okay.
I remember looking up which one came first. I can't remember now. But
that's an interesting question, yeah.
And then in the Next Generation, you've got Devil's Due.
Yes.
Where it's rather more traditional. Is this really the devil? Oh, no, it turns out it's just somebody that's got a lot of scientific know-how that misusing it, basically.
But we find out that the Klingons have a devil character with a
that's right.
And I suppose that idea of the Faustian pact, which is, you know, what Devil's Due is all about, is this idea of making a pact with the devil. And interestingly, it didn't struck me till I was thinking about this, but, you know, Sisko has one of those. In The Pale Moonlight, the title of the episode, you know, did you, whatever, dance with the devil in The Pale Moonlight?
It's straight from Batman,
Exactly, a quote, which I think is, you know, Deep Space Nine is wonderful with its references in its episode titles.
I remember looking that up thinking, that sounds like Batman.
I know.
And you look it up in Memory Alpha, yes, that's where they took it from.
Exactly. Not Shakespeare.
Okay. The classics then.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. But I mean, definitely that idea is sort of in there. And the fact that they chose that line for the title was to put a pin on that almost, in a way, to say, yes, and of course, this kind of Faustian element here.
In Deep Space Nine, it's the Power Wraiths, sort of the evil force, as opposed to the prophets who are the good. And it seems to suggest, certainly that the beginning of season 7, that those sort of visions that Sisko's experiencing are actually to do with the Power Wraiths, and they're trying to hold him back. So he's literally, you know, in Bajoran standards, being tempted by the devil here. And,
And they're very much, they've been expelled from the celestial temple, just like the fallen angels have been expelled. There's this, very much that kind of idea of the
and they come from the fire caves.
Fire caves, yeah. And, they do the red eyes and they do all the kind of evil, like traditional kind of, TV sort of movie stuff. And also they have this kind of weird cult built around them. I mean, Gul Dukat becomes, this cult leader, basically, preaching the way of the Paraiths. And even Kai Wynn, of course, gets sort of seduced by them as well. So there is that idea of,
Again, but she's interesting because she's a religious leader that she actually confesses she hadn't had a religious experience. So the prophet, she actually tells Kira, the prophets have never spoken to me. And it's like, hey, really? So how did you end up as effectively Pope of this religion?
I know. And that again, I think, is another one of those moments where weirdly you feel sorry for her. You do sort of pity her because, in the Reckoning, where she kind of pulls the plug on that fight because she, as they put it, she sort of lacks the faith to see it through in a sense. But there's also that scene earlier where Kira is is possessed by the prophet.
Yeah, she
and Wynn basically goes up to see her and is like, I'm the Kai of Bajor. I'm your link to the world or whatever. And the prophet just blanks her completely, will not speak to her. And you do feel sorry for her in a way, like she's given her whole life to this cause, and her these beings that she reveres just literally don't see her. They kind of have no use for her whatsoever. And so, of course, she does get sucked into the Paraiths who want her.
Or is it, of course, that the prophets already know how it's going to turn out, and that's why they blank her, because they know that it's going to come from her.
Your persona non grata
around
here, pretty much. Yeah, definitely. I mean, it is... I have to say, I have always slightly struggled with that final arc, with the Paraith element of the final arc of Deep Space Nine. I always find it seems a little bit much somehow, but it is it sort of half makes sense anyway that Wynn would go there. And certainly it makes sense that she'd get herself into something pretty bad. But definitely with the Paraiths, we have that kind of idea of these satanic characters and this kind of satanic cult. And I guess it's kind of interesting because we do have Satanists in the real world. I don't know that they've ever had as much kind of power or sway or whatever as in Dukat's hands they seem to be in danger of having. Do you know what I mean? That's becoming like he's got quite a lot of followers in that situation and quite a lot of power and so on. But I guess, again, that is sort of tying into... It's interesting, again, that they chose to go there, having presented the Bajoran religion about the prophets and having found these sort of demon characters, they decided to kind of create a whole other sort of anti-religion about them as well.
And it comes quite late on, and Deep Space Nine wasn't as tightly plotted out as other series, so if they found a good idea, they generally ran with it. So I know my wife Anne-Marie is not at all keen on. She liked the fact that initially the Bajoran religion it wasn't yin and yang. It was just something that enhanced people's lives and gave them a sense that they were being looked after by these beings beyond them, and gave them faith in times of need. And she kind of felt like it was a bit cheap to then start introducing a dark side, as every religion ends up seeming to have to develop. So.
That's an interesting point, actually. It makes it seem less alien, I suppose.
Yes, that's certainly less unique as well.
Yeah. No, I can see that, definitely. And I suppose partly because a lot of those stories about the Paraiths and so on, they do feel like they're leaning on quite well-trodden tropes, in a way, whether that's to do with how they're visually represented or the kind of, or the behaviour of the people in the cult or whatever it is. It doesn't feel massively original, maybe.
No. And initially, of course, it's just introduced just to make Keiko evil for an episode so they can torture O'Brien. So that's how it all came. And then they thought, this works quite well, and sort of ran with it.
Yeah. I quite like that episode. And I think it's kind of what I like about it is it almost feels like they're sort of engaging with all the people who hate Keiko already.
This is like, you thought you hated Keiko before.
I know, exactly. But the weird thing is she's not that different.
Exactly. Spot the difference.
It's that kind of, she's bossing Miles around and, he's miserable and under the thumb and so on. But in fact now it's because she's this kind of evil, alien,
large,
demonic entity. I guess the other thing that Deep Space Nine has, of course, is these kind of characters who, most obviously Sisko as the emissary, but we also get with Odo characters who are revered without wanting it. Do you know what I mean? Without seeking it. I mean, with Odo, we get this kind of this idea that to the Vorta but mainly the Vorta, I suppose, he's seen as a god. So Yoon, for example, sees him as a god. Sisko obviously is seen as the emissary, seen as was going to say as a prophet. He's not seen as, I mean, he does turn out to be partly a prophet, but he's seen as, what we might call a prophet. He's seen as this kind of revered religious icon in a sense. And I guess both of them in some ways have elements of this kind of, Sisko in particular has this kind of Messiah element around him, doesn't he? He has this kind of reluctant Messiah, reluctant kind of Messiah figure. It made me think also, I don't know if you've seen that every Christmas, that meme that goes round for the hallmark ornament of Spock and Kirk in the Wrath of Khan.
Yes.
Spock giving up his life. And it says, I took down the words because I thought it was quite funny. It says, celebrate Christmas with an ornament about a man who died to save others, then rose from the dead to the joy of many.
Yep.
That element of, Spock as a Jesus character, which I suppose does, it is definitely a way of looking at that trilogy of films that, we do have this cycle of...
There's that great moment in Star Trek 4 when McCoy tries to engage Spock, tell me about the afterlife, effectively, and it's like, well, I can't talk to you about a common frame of reference. It's like, damn it, you mean to say I have to die before we can share this conversation?
The ironic thing, of course, is in Star Trek, there's quite a lot of characters who come back from the dead one way or another. I mean, McCoy might not have done it. I don't think. I can't remember. He probably had, to be honest. But, Spock could have had a club to, to share their kind of resurrection stories. But definitely, I think, and if you look at like all the Vulcan stuff in Star Trek 3, as you say, it's a very kind of religious ceremony, but it also feels very ancient. And I suppose the fact that Vulcan is this very... It feels almost like a sort of Middle Eastern desert kind of environment. You know what I mean? And the kind of, all the robes and all the kind of... It's not a million miles away from one of those kind of, the greatest story ever told, or those kind of movies about those kind of religious stories.
You do expect them to wheel out the Ark of the Covenant any minute now. Lift the lid. I mean, it's interesting how the Vulcans effectively have a religion built around logic. So it doesn't require a divine being, although Sarek is probably as close as Surak is as close as they get. It's got huge elements of religion to it, and that was Star Trek 3 is the obvious example where they have ritual, they have gowns. They have, that's not particularly logical, is it? But it's all part of the system, interestingly.
Definitely. And I guess it's part of that thing, the Vulcans, they have to have all these rituals, even if you think about like the way they deal with the Pon farr or anything like that, to kind of deal with their emotions. Do you know what I mean? They're kind of, they're propping up their society in some ways. They're kind of holding it together. It's the sense that you get. Do you know what I mean? They need these kind of very ancient traditions, even as they seem to be quite a modern, rational kind of scientific.
All the while they're struggling with what they're keeping bottled in, and it's
exactly
religion logic that enables them to do that.
Yeah. I guess just going back to Deep Space Nine, so we've got Sisko, who's the emissary. He is this kind of reluctant Messiah, but at the same time, we do have these kind of links, with the kind of Jesus character, because we find out towards the end of Deep Space Nine, was he immaculately conceived? He was sort of, he was, at least there was a spirit in his mother at the time, wasn't he? So
it's the really weird thing is that a prophet takes control of the woman that turns out to be his mother for a couple of years and gives birth to a baby, then leaves the woman behind, leaving her very confused as to why she's with this guy and she's got a son suddenly.
Which raises sort of weird consent issues.
Well, there are huge issues, but then again, the prophets don't understand such things because they're outside linear time, you see. So it works. It's horrifying, but it works. And yes, that sense that, the reason why, you get a reason why he is the emissary is not the chosen one by accident, but actually it's been designed all the way along by the prophets.
And it's interesting that the journey that he takes to kind of coming to accept it, I suppose, from having been quite kind of resistant to it, to really embracing it, and and making prophecies himself. He makes that prophecy about the locusts, which again, it has real kind of biblical overtones, doesn't it?
And then you get sort of Starfleet brass hovering over his shoulder going, we're really not comfortable with this.
It's one thing to kind of go along with it, but once you start making prophecies and telling people, blessing them and, all this sort of thing, it's kind of... But I suppose that he was doing the blessing people before, wasn't he? As a kind of just out of politeness.
He was to begin with.
When he starts meaning it, then you're in trouble.
See, Jake's interesting because he's not comfortable with it either. And you
Which
get
is
that,
fair enough.
Particularly when you get that episode where he's in the pale moonlight when he's getting the visions and things, and they're worried that they've lost him effectively at one point.
Right. In Rapture.
I think. Rapture I'm thinking of.
When he starts, he thinks he can see because he has that kind of divine. He says he almost understood the whole universe.
Yes,
he could hold it in his
and
hands,
that's right. And then it's lost
at
the end through Bashir's scientific interference.
Changeling Bashir, as it turns out later.
Yes, as well, really weirdly.
Makes you watch it and you think, now, what's his agenda here? Yes. Is it not great for the Dominion if he starts having all these visions? But so you've got a real contrast, I guess, between Sisko, who is this kind of reluctant messiah, but ultimately takes it on, ultimately is willing to commit to it 100%, versus, Kirk in the Paradise Syndrome, who is taken for a god. And he does sort of go along with it because he doesn't know any better to some extent, but at the same time, it's very obvious it's a mistake, versus Picard, who is just like, well, I'm absolutely not going there. Don't even ask me. We're not playing that game. But then you also have Odo, I guess, who again is this kind of reluctant god character. He doesn't want to be seen as a god. But then he ends up sort of having to use his sway with Weyoun almost, when the station is under occupation and so on. He kind of uses that. He plays the God card almost in order to. I mean, I guess
he would see it as playing the founder card, and he doesn't see the founders as gods because he's kind of
but if you ask Weyoun, there's no
exactly,
there's no
and the difference there is, of course, Weyoun and the Jem'Hadar, the Vorta and the Jem'Hadar are all genetically modified to believe they are gods. They don't. There's no free will in this. There's no choice. It's the way they were built. Which is you understand Odo being horrified by that, really, and not comfortable with that.
Yeah. And you get, I suppose, with Deep Space Nine, there's almost, once they kind of let religion in, it seems to kind of crop up all over the place. So you've got the Dominion have this religion, you've got even the Ferengi supposedly have their own religion.
Yes,
it's like
well, they've got a heaven, haven't they? The divine treasury.
So it's kind of like, I don't know, once they've opened the floodgates, it all starts, all these stories start pouring in.
I was thinking earlier today whether the Cardassians had anything particularly religious about them. I don't think they did.
Not that I can think of.
Yeah, because they're always looking down the noses at the Bajorans as a spiritual people, meant very much as an insult.
It's interesting. Yeah. A lot of culture, you get the sense Cardassia has a lot of kind of cultural background, doesn't it? Literature and,
Yes, but a lot of it, I think, has been repressed over the years by totalitarian governments, and you wonder whether they did have a religious past that was buried.
Yeah. I guess just thinking about these kind of messiah characters as well, you often get this sort of tension between, we talked a bit about the Emperor Kahless, who's actually a clone. Yeah. We talked a bit about Tom and B'Elanna's daughter, who's, it does save these people from the disease they're suffering from, but at the same time, they rationalise it in terms of her stem cells and so on. So again, there's this kind of not quite reproductive technology, but sort of, it sort of taps into that. There's always this kind of the line between the sort of science and religion again. But I was just thinking about Odo again. Odo also has this element that he is incarnated at one point. He stops being a founder when he's punished and he's made into a humanoid, essentially. Almost like, Jesus being a human being. Do you know what I mean? About that idea, like putting the divine into a kind of solid human form. And he does have that same sort of journey in a way of like learning to understand humanity through living it. Do you know what I mean? And being forced to deal with kind of bodily stuff.
Taking that experience back to the link with him and eventually sort of turning them around. So yes, there's very an incarnational model, to use a theological term, going on there.
Which is interesting for a character who is so against that interpretation, against his own divinity. He doesn't really want to acknowledge it. He doesn't want to... And I don't think he ever quite reconciles with it the way that Sisko does, certainly. But at the same time, he does kind of perform that role for the Dominion. Exactly what they intended, really, the founders, when they sent these changelings out to kind of go and learn about the universe and so on and come back and give them this information. He does sort of change them fundamentally.
Yeah, no, there are parallels to be made there, certainly, yeah.
The other thing that struck me just thinking about Sisko again, and maybe this is, to some degree, there's elements that may be linked to Odo here as well, but it's this idea of sacrifice. And what we see, you talked about Jake being very uncomfortable, Jake kind of pulling the plug, but this idea of how far is Sisko willing to go from the point that he accepts that he is the emissary and that he has this kind of destiny and he has this kind of role, how far is he willing to take it? So in Rapture, he's willing to risk his own life. Yeah. Jake ultimately isn't and pulls the plug on it. And although Sisko can understand that, he's obviously very disappointed. But, it seems very... obviously Starfleet captains are frequently willing to risk their own lives for things, but the fact that he's willing to risk his life for this kind of spiritual quest almost is unusual. In The Reckoning, even more surprising, really, it seems Sisko's willing to risk Jake's life, or even to sacrifice Jake. I mean, those are the terms in which it's talked about. And of course, you know, in the religious context, it makes you think of Abraham and Isaac and this idea of, you know, being forced to sacrifice your own child to please your God or whatever. And that is sort of what Sisko appears to be willing to do. And that's part of what Kira says to Kai Wynn at the end is, you know, that's why his faith is stronger than yours, because he's willing to do it. But at the same time, I can't help wondering, obviously he didn't have to do it. But also, at the end of that episode, he's on the verge of tears thinking about it and trying to explain to Jake what he did and why he did it. And Jake kind of lets him off the hook because he says, no, I understand that being was so evil, it had to be killed. You know, killing me would be the right thing if it meant killing that being. But at the same time, Sisko obviously is having a kind of real understandable human feeling of guilt about that.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? About the fact that he was ultimately willing to go that far and he almost can't believe it himself.
Yeah, and he does it again at the beginning of season 7, drags his, not just Jake, but also his father as well, to this desert planet, pretty much on a whim in order to be able to reopen the wormhole ultimately. So he gets sort of emissary blinkers, doesn't he, from time to time, and he's not paying attention to family and indeed to being a Starfleet officer. There's no sort of, it's not a sense of a sort of balanced journey that he's making. He tends to sort of lurch from, no, I'm not the emissary, that's his nonsense business, to at times he's taking it so seriously, it's even to, as you point out, putting his own family members at risk.
But it's not just putting them at risk. I mean, I would say, like, you're right, the episode is it Shadows and Symbols, where they're searching around in the forest, in the desert or whatever. I mean, yes, I suppose his dad's quite elderly, and we've picked up from earlier episodes his health's not very good, so it probably was a bad move bringing him along. But I don't think, well, I've never watched that episode and thought he was literally going to, you know, peg out as a result. But I suppose maybe that's a good point.
And you know, so Jake's trying to get them to slow down.
Yeah, that's true.
Partly I'm watching it thinking,
he's kind of obsessive.
Brock Peters was in his 70s. He's filming in this desert. It seems very unfair on him somehow. But there you are.
Oh well, you know, you take the job.
I guess
it goes with the job, doesn't it?
Hollywood folks.
But I mean, definitely, I think in The Reckoning, there's this sense that he's more. It's hard to say it's deliberate, because you're right, he's kind of swept up in this kind of fervour. And obviously the way Avery Brooks plays Sisko in those moments is very intense. It's very kind of, it doesn't seem very calm and considered, if you know what I mean. No, it's very much in the moment. But at the same time, there is that kind of, it seems like he's aware of the consequences. Do you know what I mean? He's aware of the possible consequences. And he keeps saying, don't worry, they'll protect him. But do we think he really believes that or not? That's the question. Is he just trying to convince himself of that? Because it seems pretty unlikely on the face of it, you know, given the stakes of what's going on in that situation. And then I guess at the end of the series as well, you know, he sacrifices himself by hurling himself into the fire cave or whatever, and then having to go and leave, you know, and he goes and, you know, that's the last we see of him, is almost this moment of self-sacrifice. And I know there's this kind of promise that he's going to return one day, you know, like the Messiah who will come back sometime. But, you know, we have no idea whether he did or when it was, or, you know, unless we read the novels, obviously. But, you know.
Yes.
As far as kind of canonical on-screen Star Trek is concerned, that question is as open as it is in any religion that has a Messiah who says they're going to come back, and, you know, people are waiting. And it's a weird, you know, ending to that story in some ways, to leave that so open. Yeah,
but that kind of fits with how Deep Space Nine has been dealing with, particularly with the prophets and the religion around it, trying to keep it open-ended, and say, you know, neither trying to come down on completely one side or the other.
Definitely trying to keep those two kind of elements in play, which I guess we see often when there's a prophecy and there's kind of... I think of that, like that episode Destiny, where there's a prophecy that they think is going to come true one way and then it sort of comes true another way. But there's always a sort of scientific workaround as well. If you don't really want to believe in the prophecy, you can kind of, it's called X-Files solution. You can kind of go one way or the other. You can almost sort of pick your sides. And there's also that element with prophecies, I think, because obviously there's a lot of prophecies in Deep Space Nine, that they're partly a narrative device, I think. So there's an element of, you know, if you're going to have a prophecy, you can't have a prophecy mentioned on screen and then it just doesn't happen at all. Do you know what I mean? It would be unsatisfying as a viewer. So it has to come true to some extent, even if, you know, maybe you can twist it, you can subvert it in some way.
The locusts coming down on Bajor, and it turns out it's the Dominion.
Exactly, So it kind of has to... It has to be real as far as the logistics of narrative are concerned. Whether or not we might think it were real in a kind of rational, scientific world in a way. But there's also that element, there's a kind of, a prophecy is almost like a teaser. So you have this idea of, the penance that will be exacted, and that kind of hangs over the series for, a couple of, a couple of seasons, basically, sort of trying to work out what is this kind of looming threat, and there's that element with a prophecy that you have this potential for kind of particularly these doom-laden prophecies, like you see in The Reckoning, where they're saying, something terrible will engulf the
that's because they didn't follow through with the Reckoning and having the final, and that's going to then have consequences later on.
Yeah. So in some ways, if that was originally going to be the penance, he sort of dodged that bullet and ended up with, he had a different kind of penance maybe by the end of the series, that he's not going to see his wife and his other child for some indefinite period of time, if that's how you interpret it. I mean, I guess it's sort of open to interpretation by that point, but at the same time, they are sort of using it as a way of like stirring the pot a bit and kind of keeping you interested in the ongoing narrative. I just thought, finally, we might talk a little bit about... I was looking at an interview with Ira Stephen Bear talking about Deep Space Nine, and he was talking about the decision to bring religion into that series and what a big deal that was. And he said a couple of things I thought were quite interesting. One of them was that he said that it came immediately after the decision to bring money into the series, that basically, because they were seen as these two things that Gene Roddenberry was so vehemently against in this kind of utopian future, that weirdly, once they brought the Ferengi in and they brought in this idea of cash, essentially, with Latinum, that it was easier to bring in religion somehow, that it was kind of... so there's this weird link between the two things, that they were the traditional... They were outside the Roddenberry box, and then once one had been let in, the other could be let in too. But the other thing he said that I thought was quite interesting was that the key for them with bringing religion in was that they didn't call it religion, they called it faith. And that was the idea, was that faith was something that people of all religions or no religion could kind of accept. I mean, we see it obviously in Enterprise, Faith of the Heart, which is a kind of secular... Whatever you think of that song. Don't worry, I'm not going to sing it. Whatever you think of that song is a secular concept of faith. And I suppose what they try to do by using the term faith is to find a way of making it more sort of inclusive and making it more sort of acceptable.
Yes, I guess. I mean, in both cases, they managed to sidestep it by having neither of them being in Starfleet. So I don't think we see. I mean, the really weird thing is, by the end of season 6, Dax is going to the Bajoran temple.
Right.
I think that's about the only, and I suppose arguably Worf, but he's not a human being, so that's like bias that Starfleet has towards the human beings. But generally, human Starfleet officers don't have religion, even in Deep Space Nine. And likewise, somehow or other, Starfleet still doesn't have money. Even though they've got a bar tab at Quark's. How's that being paid? Never explained. But so they've got other cultures where you can explore faith and you can explore economics and all the other bits and pieces that are arguably lacking in Star Trek before. And the way they've done it is through the melting pot that is Deep Space Nine, and pushing these different cultures together. That's probably why it's my favourite series of all. Well, you probably guessed, but it's my favourite of the Trek series.
It's an interesting point you make about Dax, actually, because not only is Dax, as far as we know, I mean, I don't think we ever hear about any kind of religious belief for the Trill, but also she is the kind of implacable scientist. And in all these episodes where they're dealing with these religious questions, she's the one kind of... sort of putting in her 2 cents, kind of putting in the kind of Roddenberry position, almost sort of saying, well, can we please call them wormhole aliens? And actually, this is a load of rubbish. And exactly, like, don't get too swept up in all of this. So it is interesting that she gets to this point where she's willing to... She's desperate in a sense, exactly. And she's and she's seen the impact that these prophets have had on her friends and so on. I mean, she's seen the fact that they turned the tides in the war basically by intervening in that way. I mean, it is a real kind of Deus Ex Machina when they when they stop those ships, and that she's willing to do that to kind of. It's not. I don't know whether it's almost so much a matter of belief or as a matter of pride. Do you know what I mean? That she's willing to go and do that and to ask for something from them, and then of course. Weird thing is she gets what she wants insofar as there's this idea that she is going to be able to have a child, and then she's killed. So she doesn't get it. So it's that kind of I don't know. It's a very loaded moment in a sense in terms of all the meanings you might draw out of that. But definitely it's an interesting intersection, I suppose, of the kind of, a bit like with Janeway on her spiritual quest, the kind of scientific rationalist, the scientist really coming up against this kind of belief system and finding a way to communicate with it.
And where the tensions always come from, both religious and from a science background, is when either party haven't got an open mind, but they've already decided what the answers are.
Right, yeah.
And Deep Space Nine in particular is about exploring, people who thought they had a certain set of answers are actually, it could be interpreted in another way, or indeed that the answers might be quite different to what they were expecting them to be. So it's the open-minded track for me.
Absolutely, yeah. And I suppose the other way of looking at it that strikes me is that one thing that religion, Star Trek, science, all these things have in common is an interest in kind of awe, an interest in something that's bigger than us, that's bigger than kind of everyday human concerns, the sublime, I suppose you might think of it, or the divine, however you want to see it. And I suppose we do see that in Star Trek repeatedly in these kind of, in the wonder of space, the kind of majesty of it, the awe, the reverence with which kind of spatial phenomena are treated as a purely kind of scientific phenomenon, but at the same time as something that, you'll go out of your way to witness a supernova or, one of these kind of stellar events. And there is that episode of Enterprise. I mean, funnily enough, although, we said Enterprise doesn't have much room for religion, the only real episode I can think of is the one with the suicide bombers, basically. That kind of gives you an idea of where Enterprise's general take on religion is. But at the same time, there is the episode, Cold Front, I think, where a group of celebrants arrive on board. It's the one where you were saying where Phlox is saying, I went to the, I studied the Hindu religion and I went to the Vulcan services and so on. And they've come to witness some kind of spatial phenomenon, basically, but they see it as a religious experience. And there's this kind of disjunct between the crew of the Enterprise who are treating it very scientifically and these people who are on this kind of religious experience, although turn out to be quite rational and practical themselves. It's just they're on a bit of a pilgrimage, because there's that scene where Trip is quite surprised to discover that one of them's a warp theorist and actually, knows all about warp engines and so on. He sort of assumes, if he's a religious person, he's going to be a sort of simpleton or something,
or not have anything to do with science.
Exactly, not interested in science. But so there is, in the end, I suppose there's that element of they might mean different things to different people, but they can all appreciate the kind of wonder of this thing and the kind of beauty of it. And it's almost something they've got in common. Everyone can experience the majesty of the universe, whether they think that's a scientific majesty that evolved out of, scientific processes or a kind of divine majesty or however they want to interpret it. And it's something that comes up. I was just looking at talking about Deep Space Nine as the most kind of the series that's the most kind of enmeshed in this idea of kind of incorporating faith and religious belief. It's there even in the scripting of the series. If you look at the script for the last episode of Deep Space Nine, I've printed it out, so I'm going to read it here. This is literally the last page of the last episode. It says, external space, Deep Space Nine optical. Looking in on Jake and Kira standing by the window, the camera slowly begins to pull back past the usual station shot and continuing further and further away, the station becoming smaller and smaller and smaller still, until finally Deep Space Nine becomes just one more bright but distant star in the vast cathedral of space. So again, there's that sort of, must be a conscious choice of words to invoke this kind of religious awe, specifically religious awe, at the moment of the closure of this series, which is a big move for Star Trek, obviously, to do that. But at the same time, is it just a metaphor, or is it kind of hinting at something beyond that?
Yeah, and Starfleet has sort of taken the exploration of space and expanding scientific knowledge to quite a sort of dogmatic, almost religious level. You see it in Deep Space Nine, where they're constantly going into the Gamma Quadrant, even after they've discovered about the Dominion, because they've got to explore. Yeah. And it's like, well, hang on a minute, you just got your butts kicked. There was a Galaxy-class ship, blasted into pieces, and here you are going out exploring on some planet just because it's what we do. It's Starfleet.
Almost like the missionaries, kind of, that's their mission. It's their continuing mission, to go out there and do that. And you get that in Voyager as well. Neelix sort of saying, "What's wrong with you? Are you all mad?
Yes.
You're supposed to be going home. Just stick to the plan. Don't get diverted for all these other sort of interests." But I suppose that again, it is part of that kind of absorbing the wonder of the universe, whatever that means to you personally.
We explore, therefore we are.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, that seems like a nice place to wrap things up here, really. But before we go, Peter, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit more about how they can find you online, and if they want to listen to your podcast, where they can find them?
Okay. Well, I'm on Twitter as rev_org, so rev_org. But also we, together with my wife, we do the Borgcast, B-O-R-G, and that's on iTunes and on Libsyn. And we've just started the last season of Deep Space Nine. We've covered most of Next Generation. I was forced to cheat because Amory is not a big fan of season 1 of Next Generation. Riker without a beard is an anathema.
But you did cover Justice, I saw.
Yes,
yeah.
we've done bits, and literally got to the point where we were doing a couple of seasons whilst we were covering Deep Space Nine. But then we got whiplash, basically, because Deep Space Nine got really, really good, and first season Next Generation was so bad that we couldn't carry on. But I will fill in the rest of the gaps, not necessarily with Amory at some point. We also cover the movies as well. And we've also been covering Discovery, which we haven't mentioned yet, interestingly.
We haven't, no, that's a very good point.
And religion in Discovery is, at the moment anyway, fairly much sort of restricted to the Klingons, and we're learning a lot more about the Klingons. We
are, definitely. And again, I suppose that idea of the sort of messianic figure. I don't know that it doesn't have all that much of a kind of spirit. Well, it has a spiritual air in terms of like treatment of the dead and in terms of these kind of beliefs and practices and so on. But does it have a kind of supernatural side? Do you know what I mean? Yes. Is it more a matter of cultural? Because I guess what we often see in Star Trek is religion as cultural practice, which is sort of what Phlox is talking about when he's saying, "Oh, I'll go and pray with the Hindus, or do whatever with the Vulcans, or whatever it is." Is it kind of putting religious practice in a purely kind of cultural box in a way, rather than?
It depends, because if you're justifying what you're doing because that's how you're going to get into Stovocall, then I guess that's a more sort of religious, less practical side to it. But
slightly kind of fundamentalist.
Yes. Yeah. So it's interesting to see how Discovery is. I was not convinced to begin with, as to be said, but I got gradually won over. So I'm quite interested to see how season 2 pans out. So we'll be covering that on the podcast as well.
Well, I say compared to season 1 of any Star Trek, since 1966, they're probably, they're not doing too badly.
The hardest part was getting over the Klingon makeup, which I never quite managed, particularly when it was revealed it was only to cover up the identity of one of the actors. Was a bit of a cheat.
There are a few, there are visual surprises in Discovery, definitely. But I think, it may be one of those things in, 10 years' time we'll look back and think,
yes, we'll be cool with that. Hopefully.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us on Primitive Culture. It's been a pleasure to have you here, and thank you for hosting me in this beautiful church.
That's okay. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's been fun talking about religion and religious practice in Star Trek, but that's not the only thing we've been doing on Trek FM this week. So here's a listen to some of the other things you might have missed elsewhere on the network.
Previously on Trek.fm, Meta Treks.
You can see the Gene Roddenberry playing with the idea of what we could become given our full potential. And the aliens that have achieved that, looking down and kind of criticizing or examining or evaluating humanity from a moral standpoint, almost like Q does in putting humanity on trial. There's a sense in which humanity is being judged by these morally superior aliens that are genuinely pacifist.
Or in the case of Q, genuinely narcissistic.
The Edge, a Star Trek Discovery podcast.
He's not trying to be a Starfleet officer. He doesn't care about doing that in the context of, because I want to prove that I'm a Starfleet officer. But I think that, and again, this is what perhaps in hindsight, after the fact, he starts to realize that who he is aligns itself or can align itself with what Starfleet stands for.
To the journey!
I was wondering why they didn't do a mind meld at the end of the episode.
Why would they do that?
Because Tressa has 90 some odd years, 94 or 96 years of life experience, and Tuvok is a Vulcan, so he can mind meld. Why wouldn't he do that?
Because there's no reason to do that. You're just going around mind melding with people willy-nilly just because they're old and you want their knowledge? Is that what you're doing?
Yeah, it's like space genealogy.
Dude, boundaries.
Melodic Treks.
And, I talked to the producers when I first did the show, and the first thing they had me do was take a combination of the dun da 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 da, the Sandy Courage wonderful horn theme, and Jerry's da 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 da, his theme for the first movie, and make a theme out of those and combine them. So I did it electronically, and they said good enough, and I said, look, this is not my specialty, and they said, never mind, you got it. So 18 years later, that was it.
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
Check out all these shows and join the conversation about your favourite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're an Apple user, Be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPhone, iPad, or Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they're published. And please leave us a star rating and a written review. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, and in most third-party apps. And you can stream and download the MP3 file from our website or grab the RSS link. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's show, and there are many ways for you to do that. The best place is to join the larger conversation at the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type in Babel, that's B-A-B-E-L, into the search field on Facebook and it should come right up. If you'd like to send us an email, you can use the form on our website at trek.fm/contact. Choose to send to a show and select Primitive Culture. That will come right to us. You can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. We are Primitive Culture and we are your hosts. My name is Clara Cook and you can find me on Twitter at ClaraJeanMC. My co-host is Duncan Barrett and you can find Duncan on Twitter at Barrett's Books. If you'd like to help us keep all our shows coming to you each week, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/TrekFM. That's patreon.com/TrekFM to get all the details. Perks include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more, available through our special patrons website, Patron Zone. It requires a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month. We really appreciate any support you can give us, and hope you'll join the team. Again, you'll find all the details at patreon.com/TrekFM. Now I'd like to express a big thank you to our executive producer, Amy Nelson. You can find Amy Nelson on the Earl Grey podcast on Trek FM. So thank you everyone for listening to this episode of Primitive Culture, a Trek FM podcast about our history, our culture, and how Star Trek relates to it.
You're blended already.